NBC News and CNN this morning, both reporting a fence that can't be climbed is going to be erected around the entire perimeter of the White House grounds. We know the president is going to watch the returns there Tuesday night with 400 guests, but a fence that cannot be climbed. Now, the security service will not confirm the reports, but there was a fence in place last summer during the protests in Washington. All of this leading to a conversation now with Stephen Pomper, who is the Senior Director for Policy with the International Crisis Group. He has also served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights at the National Security Council under President Obama. He is with me from Washington this morning. Mr. Pomper, welcome to our program. Delighted to have you.
Thanks for having me, Heather.
I spent considerable time this weekend, Mr. Pomper, reading your report, and I have to say I found it quite unsettling. The 2020 U.S. presidential election presents risks not seen in recent history. What are the particular ingredients, the risk factors that are creating what you termed an unfamiliar danger?
Well, there are quite a few, Heather, but we identified just a handful in particular. One is that there's an enormous level of political polarization in the United States right now, and that's overlaid with issues of race and identity. That's a major risk factor when we look at it in other countries around the world. Another is the presence of armed groups, militias, that have identified with a particular political agenda across the political fringes of the spectrum here, but mainly on the right. The third would be the possibility of a contested outcome to the election that could drag on for days and weeks, and that could allow tensions to build. And then I think the final factor, and this is unusual to this particular election, is the Trump factor, that we have a president of the United States now who, as the videos that you just showed demonstrated, seems to have an instinct for courting conflict in order to create pressure for his personal and political agenda. And that's a very dangerous factor.
Can we talk about each in a little bit more detail, if you don't mind? Come back to the violence that you just mentioned. Again, to quote your report, the United States now faces the specter of electoral violence. And as we bring in some pictures, some of the things that we've seen, Mr. Pomper, we're seeing stores put boards up, get ready for violence or civil unrest. We're seeing that kind of action in many cases for the first time ever. We're hearing of police forces training and bringing in extra officers. We're hearing about gun purchases, record numbers of gun sales in the United States, 17 million, the figure that I learned over the weekend. So what is the likelihood of violence in your view, and what type of violence is possible?
Well, I think we were pretty careful in the report to make clear that we're not talking about the United States spiraling into a second civil war. What we do worry about is sporadic incidents of violence, of either groups or individuals being inspired by the president's words or by their own sense of political mission to take actions that could be, dangerous and escalatory. And don't forget that the United States has been in the middle of a major protest wave since Memorial Day, when George Floyd, an unarmed black man, was killed in Minneapolis. There have been waves of protests. There have been incidents where violent individuals on both sides of the protests and the counter-protests have mixed it up in cities like Portland. So the tinder here is pretty dry. And the worry is that if somebody gets inspired in the wrong way, does something violent, the situation could escalate. It would probably start in one region, but it could spread across the country, and you could see another surge of activity like we saw after the George Floyd killing. That would be probably a bad case scenario.
Bad case as far as outcome is what you referred to and did mention as a protracted contestation as being possible. Today, for example, we're watching a court case in Texas, an emergency hearing, because of contested 127,000 ballots cast at a drive-in polling station, a drive-through polling station. Both sides are lawyered up. There are some 400 lawsuits already. What are the scenarios we should be watching for and could potentially see as in terms of contested outcome here?
So the worry, I think, is that one of the strengths and weaknesses of the American system is it's very decentralized. The way that presidential elections work here is that there's a lot of authority that rests with states and with localities. And this year, because of the pandemic, you have quite a few votes that are being cast by mail for the first time. I think in some states, the volume of mail-in ballots is something like 10 times the amount that they've ever had before. So the concern, I think, when people talk about contestation is there's going to be an enormous volume of these ballots that need to be counted. They're not going to all be able to be counted on election day. Some of them will need to be counted in the period afterwards. The president's already gone out and said that he wants the results in on election night. There's a reason for that. Because Democrats trust mail-in voting more than Republicans do, and I think he's hoping that he'll be ahead on election night and be able to sort of freeze a lead at that point, claim that the mail-in voting is fraudulent in some way, challenge it in court, and then gin up his supporters potentially to sort of create additional pressure in the streets. I think if that happens, you're going to see a reaction on the left as well, and that protest and counter-protest creates a forum where bad things can happen.
You describe it as they have not, as in Americans have not in living memory faced the realistic prospect that the incumbent may reject the outcome, as Donald Trump has signaled now for months, not just signaled, but said so quite clearly and blatantly. In terms of his role in all of that, the extraordinary nature of the presidential's comments actually sort of creating the conditions for exactly the situations you described. How extraordinary is that in your view?
Completely. I mean, it's unprecedented. I mean, one of the features of this president that his supporters like is that he is unconventional. He does sort of drive outside or draw outside the lines in terms of the things he's willing to say. But when you're the president of the United States, those words carry an enormous amount of weight. And as you can see, people are reacting to it.
Can the system withstand these challenges? Can the institutions in the United States withstand these challenges, Mr. Pomper?
Let's hope.
Really? That's pretty, I guess, all will be revealed. I mean, not even sure, but is there a way?
Let me be clear. This is a mature democracy with very strong institutions. I think they've performed reasonably well under a fair amount of stress in recent years. These are not just federal institutions. They're institutions at the state and local level. But I do think this is a moment of testing. And I mean, everybody in the United States has a stake, I think, in seeing the institutions perform well. And frankly, because of the role that the United States plays in the rest of the world, I think the rest of the world has a stake in it too. So when I say let's hope, I'm perhaps being a little bit glib, but I'm expressing a heartfelt thought as well.
Mr. Pomper, I very much appreciate it. It is an important reading, and as I said, rather sobering in terms of potential outcomes here. Stephen Pomper, thank you. Senior Director for Policy with the International Crisis Group from Washington.